Hello, I'm Patricia Van Skyke, Executive Director of the Lloyd Library and Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'd like to welcome you to our program, Cooking with Mushrooms with Eugenia Bone. The Lloyd Library and Museum was founded more than 140 years ago by the Lloyd brothers, three pharmacists who worked in the field of nature-based medicine. One of them, Curtis Gates Lloyd, was also a mycologist who collected books dating back to the 1600s on fungi, along with specimens at the turn of the 20th century. In conjunction with an exhibition at the Lloyd Library, A Foray into Fungi, we are presenting a program series spanning many aspects of fungi, not the least among them, fungi as food. Our speaker tonight, Eugenia Bone, was top of my list of who to invite. As a cook, as well as someone who loves to eat, I drooled over and learned a lot from her Fantastic Fungi Community Cookbook. I'd like to give special thanks to her friend Nick Money for introducing us, and especially to Eugenia for agreeing to present tonight. Eugenia Bone is an internationally known food and science writer whose works have appeared in the New York Times, Gourmet, BBC Science, and the Wall Street Journal, to name a few. She's the author of 8 books, including her latest, which I mentioned a minute ago, the Fantastic Fungi Community Cookbook. She's also a member of the American Society of Science Writers, a past president of the New York Mycological Society, and is the founder of Slow Food Western Slope in Colorado. Currently, Bone is also a faculty member of the New York Botanical Garden, where she teaches classes on mycology and psychedelic mushrooms. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Eugenia Bone.
Hello, everyone.
Hi,
Pat. Thank you so much for inviting me to the Lloyd. Thanks to the Lloyd. Thanks to Erin for helping me. I'm really grateful for your attention, and I'm honored by this invitation. I also want to thank Nick Money, in case he's out there somewhere, for introducing us. And Nick, come on, visit us in New York again. We miss you. All right, so I'd love sharing what I've learned about cooking mushrooms. And I'm especially happy that I have many gorgeous photos shot by food photographer Evan Sung. I hope they inspire you to cook mushrooms in different ways. I certainly hope they make you hungry. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we'll start this talk on the mycophagist's table. Okay. Share. Erin, how do I look? Yeah, am I good?
you look good, thanks.
Great. All right, everyone. A little bit more housekeeping while I move some little things around. And okay, let's go. So I call this talk the Mycophagist Kitchen because a mycophagist is a mushroom eater. I mean, vegetarians are vegetable eaters and carnivores are meat eaters. Mushroom eaters are mycophagists. And one of the reasons why we have our own trophic term is because mushrooms come from a kingdom of life distinct from animals and plants. When it comes to cooking them, in some ways, you can cook them like vegetables, and in other cases, you can cook them like meat. But from a culinary perspective, they are not predictably either. So we're going to look at some of the unique aspects of mushrooms and how they behave in the kitchen. So I'm a longtime food writer and nature writer and an avid mushroom hunter. So as you can see from these books, I'm most interested in the intersection of mycology, microbiology, cooking, and preserving. I'm also a master preserver, which, sounds a lot more important than it actually is. I mean, getting your master preserver certificate is actually more like getting your driver's license than getting a degree. But as a preserver, I have a long-standing interest in kitchen molds. Because even if you don't eat mushrooms, we all deal with molds. And hopefully you picked up some basic mycology if you attended Nick's mycology talk earlier in this programming. Or you know already that many fungi are composed of threads called hyphae that start from a germinated spore and grow in every direction that they have food to grow into. So let's say you encounter a coin of mold on your yogurt. The spore germinated, probably pretty much in the center, and then grew cell by cell into threads, which massed into a mycelium. The mycelium is growing three-dimensionally. It's growing in every direction there's food. So the fungus is as deep as this coin of mold is wide. What you can see are just the sporulating bodies, the little spores that are sitting on top of little fruiting structures that mold have. They don't produce mushrooms. And those little spores have color. But below the surface of the yogurt, the fungus is microscopic. So if you wanted to eat this yogurt, then you would have to scoop as deep as that coin is wide in order to get everything. But you may prefer to discard the whole thing. And that may be a good idea because some fungi produce molecules that are toxic to humans. In a soft habitat like yogurt, any toxic molecules that are produced can diffuse into the product. Whereas in a hard habitat, diffusion is much less likely. Those fungal threads, they take time to penetrate. So in the case of a hunk of Parmesan cheese like this, you can probably just scrape the mold off. So I show you these pictures, one, because we all encounter molds, but also so that you can see a little applied mycology can help us better understand when it is safe to scrape and when it is necessary to scrap. So fungal threads, or hyphae, they break down the food they like to eat by emitting the equivalent of digestive enzymes, which dissolve the bonds between large molecules. So here's an analogy. If you were a fungal spore, and you landed on a steak, and assuming the steak is what you like to eat, the way you eat it, the spore, the fungus is too small to have a stomach inside its body. So the way it would eat is it would emit, your digestive enzymes onto the steak and break down that steak and then absorb the nutrients within. So different species of mushrooms use different enzymes to break down the different kinds of foods they eat. And some of these enzymes and other, like secondary metabolites that the fungus or mushroom produces can upset your stomach, especially if they're eaten raw. So it's unwise to eat most mushrooms raw. The mushrooms, some are excellent though, and those that are excellent are Boletus edulis and others in the porcini group, Amanita caesarea, what the Italians call ovuli, and Agaricus bisporus, aka the white button mushroom. And you'll note that all three salads pictured here are pretty much prepared the same way. The mushroom is cut very thin, like, really shaved, and then dressed with oil and salt, and then garnished with herbs, and in the case of the porcini, shaven Parmesan cheese. We usually cook most mushrooms for flavor and for safety. Heating can make some otherwise toxic mushrooms palatable, but not all. For example, you can't cook an Amanita phalloides into safety. No matter what you do to that mushroom, it's going to be toxic to you. Amanita muscaria, a lot of people think is toxic, but it actually can be detoxified. Amanita muscaria contains ibotenic acid and muscimol, both of which are psychoactive and can be profound sickeners. But if you boil the mushroom, the ibotenic acid and the muscimol is pulled out of the mushroom flesh and into the water. And people who wish to, get high on this mushroom can drink what they call the tea, which is the mushroom that is filled with it's the water that has the ibotenic acid and the muscimol in it. The ibotenic acid also converts to muscimol as part of the heating process. But the beauty of it is the mushroom becomes thereafter inert. It's no longer psychoactive. The trick with Amanita muscaria is that it's really all about like how long you boil it for. I mean, how much boiling do you do? It's not clear. There's no recipe, and there's a huge amount of variety between not only different species of different kinds of Amanita, different species of Amanita that are related to Amanita muscaria, but also from specimen to specimen. So it can be really tricky. My dad had this friend, Nick Mastro Pietro. He was from Yonkers, and he had a Christmas tree farm. And one time my dad and Nick were wandering around in the farm, and Nick is this old Italian guy, and my dad is an old Italian guy too. And Nick points to the Amanita muscaria growing under one of the Christmas trees. And he says to my dad, "That's a good mushroom. You can eat that mushroom." My dad said, "No, you can't. That's a poisonous mushroom." And Nick said, No, it's really good. You just boil it first, and then, it's fine." He goes, "But afterwards, I fall into a really deep sleep." My dad's like, "You're lucky you wake up." But it's actually been used as a sleep aid in some indigenous cultures, particularly Eastern Russia, among reindeer herders. I've tried to find the dose that would make for a sleep aid, and I did get some muscimol from somebody who was extracting it. He said start with 50 milligrams, but I kind of messed up on my scale, and so I took 500 milligrams instead, and I did fall asleep, kind of passed up, but then I wake up, and then I pass up, and then I wake up. Anyway, I don't recommend it. But to eat the mushroom, given that it's been fully detoxified, it's delicious. Gyromitra esculenta, or the false morel, must be boiled to reduce the toxicity of monomethylhydrazine. It's actually a popular edible in Northern Europe. Morels actually have small amounts of monomethylhydrazine, and if undercooked or eaten raw, they have caused sickness. In fact, just today, somebody sent me an email saying, "What do you think about the Bozeman poisonings?" And I was like, "What?" And it turned out that a sushi restaurant in Bozeman, Montana, served undercooked or mainly raw morels to their customers. 41 customers, that was last April of this year, and 41 customers got sick and 2 died. So, I mean, it's assumed, right, that it was the morels, but who knows? I don't know what kind of other fish they were serving. Anyway, you can mitigate the presence of monomethylhydrazine in morels by cooking them. You just have to cook them thoroughly, and that usually is, it's usually considered to be 10 minutes in a medium high, dry or wet heat. There is no exact numbers for that, but that's the general consensus among mushroom cooks. And my Italian grandmother always boiled raw wild mushrooms before preparing a dish, and she did this to remove the poison. That's what she said. And certainly mushrooms with a reputation for causing some folks gastric upset, like chicken of the woods or honey mushrooms, that can be mitigated by boiling first. But as I said, there is no codified timing for detoxifying these mushrooms. There's only anecdotal advice. So, for example, 2 10-minute boils at sea level have removed all the psychoactives from Amanita muscaria. Oh, actually, not at sea level. I'm looking at my recipe. At 2 10-minute boils removed all the psychoactives from Amanita muscaria, picked in the Rocky Mountains and boiled at altitude. Is that transferable to the East Coast varietals at sea level? We just don't know. Mushrooms are really diverse organisms. We commonly eat about 30 in the United States, and in some cases, they need to be treated differently to be palatable. So, for example, Fistulina hepatica is bitter, but my colleague Eleanor Shavit says soak it in milk and it'll remove the acridity. Dryad saddles, which come up at the same time as morels in the spring, are not, in the spring here in the East, are not good old. They're pretty tough, but they're delicious when they're very young. And that's the same for sheep's polypore, at least in those that grow in the Rocky Mountains. I do a lot of mushroom hunting in the Rocky Mountains and in the East Coast. In my opinion, hawkswing also becomes less palatable with age. It gets kind of bitter and fibrous. And still others change depending on their host. So chicken of the woods, Latoporus sulphurus, which is a widespread mushroom. They're great if they're growing on oak, but they're toxic if they're growing on conifers. And this might very well be a reflection of this absorptive nature of fungi. They pick up everything. The late mycologist Tom Volt told me that when a fungus encounters something like lead in the soil, it the mycelium will say, I'm going to characterize it a little bit here, but the mycelium is going to say, oh, lead, I don't want this in my body. And so it shoves the lead into the mushroom, and the mushroom becomes a container for these things that the mycelium does not want. Lead is a very good example. Fungi are totally capable of bioaccumulating heavy metals. And so are we. I mean, if we eat too many underprocessed Gyromitra esculenta, you could eventually develop liver disease due to the bioaccumulation of monomethylhydrazine. My colleague Eleanor Shavit wrote a paper on morels and lead arsenate, because in the East Coast, we find morels under apple orchards in the spring, decaying old sort of shabby apple orchards. In the 70s, these orchards were sprayed with lead arsenate insecticide. The lead got into the soil. The morel fungus, the mycelium, is living in the soil under the tree, collecting, absorbing the lead, and then dumping it or transferring it into the mushroom. And there was this fellow from the New Jersey Mycological Society who ate morels from an abandoned orchard that had been sprayed with lead arsenate for 25, 30 years. It was his private stash of wild morels. And he developed lead poisoning and kidney disease. It was really a tragedy. He was a lovely man. There are other adaptations you can make that are helpful to make when it comes to preparing wild mushrooms. For example, not all parts of the shaggy mane are prime. I have a little film.
Introduce yourself,
She
please.
came in from the woods with a whole bunch of coprinus, and the stems are really fibrous, so we remove them. And actually what you can do is you just sort of twist the stem out of the cap, see? And this you can use to make a stock or something, but it's the cap that you will saute or cook. However, I think what I'm going to do is make a cream sauce. Shaggy manes is the common name. Thanks, Kevin, for reminding me. One more. Okay, ready to go.
It is so satisfying to pull those to pull those stems out of the caps of the shaggy manes. So inky caps here, they can cause something called antabuse poisoning if you consume them with alcohol. That's actually a little controversial. Some people say that's not really what goes on, but that's one of the reasons why their nickname is Tippler's Bane. The takeaway here is that each mushroom needs to be understood individually if you're going to get the most out of them in the kitchen. And that's the challenge, but it's also the joy. Because since when you hunt, it's really common to find a mother lode of one species, you actually get the opportunity to experiment and learn. On the other hand, sometimes you get a lot of a little bit of this species, a little bit of that one, a few different things, in which case I like to make a forest blend. And that is really just boiling the mushrooms separately, because I boil them all separately for various reasons. Sometimes I broil them and then mix them together in a vinaigrette with garlic and herbs, and then I refrigerate them, and they'll last quite a while. And it's kind of sweet because it sort of represents the day. It's a jar of the foray. Okay. Oops, sorry, this is going to just pass that. Okay, so fungi are one of 3 complex kingdoms. They are closer to animals. If you look here, they're closer to animals on the tree of life than they are to plants. And one of the many things that fungi and animals have in common is fungal cell walls are composed in part of chitin. And chitin is the same stuff as shrimp and crab shells are made of. It's a tough polysaccharide that's just not found in the plant kingdom. So how does a mushroom, which is 90% water, poke through asphalt? Chitin. We often cook mushrooms like plants, but they don't act like plants under heat. And one of the reasons is chitin. Plant cell walls are made of cellulose, and they really cook differently than mushrooms. For example, if you boil a small potato for 20 minutes, it'll probably disintegrate, not a mushroom. You can boil a mushroom to detox it, like the Amanita muscaria, or otherwise cook and then saute, and it'll hold up beautifully. And that's likely because of the chitin. I want to tell you a story briefly about this miso enoki soup. I tested the recipe, which is beautifully simple. It's just miso and tofu and some spices and enoki mushrooms. It's like it takes 20 minutes to make. It's fabulous. But I made a lot. I test for the size of the recipe, so I tested for 4, but there's just 2 of us at home now. And so the next day I recooked it. I had some clams, and so I cooked a bunch of clams in there too, and sort of turned it into a clam soup. And I thought for sure those enoki mushrooms were just going to be like limp noodles, but they were not. Despite this ongoing boiling, this second boil, they were actually had maintained their integrity, were even a little bit tough. And they held up so well because of the chitin. And that's what I think anyway. Okay, so just briefly, a bit about nutrition. So mushrooms have about as many calories as lettuce. They are composed of dietary fiber, which helps you poop, and a variety of micronutrients that are necessary for like the healthy functioning of our cells, like potassium and iron. They have vitamins, particularly the B vitamins, riboflavin and niacin, and vitamin D2, which is one of the 2 forms we commonly see. And there's a small amount of protein. Mushrooms contain, and that's high quality protein in many cases, but small amounts. Mushrooms also contain fatty acids, mostly the unsaturated type. So think avocados versus pork sausages. And of those unsaturated, of those fatty acids, unsaturated fatty acids, linoleic acid is essential. We need it, but we don't make it. So in theory, replacing saturated fats like sausages with unsaturated fats like mushrooms can reduce blood cholesterol levels, in theory. So learning about mushrooms is the first step to learning about how to cook mushrooms. To learn more about mushrooms in general, I highly recommend joining your local mushroom club. That's how I learned. And if you don't know how to find your local mushroom club, you can always go to the North American Mycological Association's website and look under clubs. They have them listed, all the ones listed in the country. So a few quick rules about picking mushrooms. I know it's tempting, but avoid picking tiny, immature specimens. They're really hard to clean. They tend to break apart anyway. And, it's just bad style. When you're out in the woods, pick clean. I know it can be hard to do that if there's a lot of mushrooms and you're like, oh, there's another, and you start like tossing them into your basket. But it really makes cleanup at home much, much easier. And it's also good to leave your spot tidy. Okay, so no one passing by would realize there's a mushroom spot there in the first place. But obviously it's really about leaving the forest pristine. For preservation and cooking in general, just don't pick lousy mushrooms. Think of it this way. If you go apple picking this fall, would you pick a rotten apple? So the next question is, how much bug can you tolerate in your mushrooms? And it's really up to you. But some insects do produce secondary metabolites that can cause GI upset. So it's kind of your call. I can actually take a little bug in my food. And certainly don't worry about mushrooms that have been nibbled by squirrels. Okay, come on. Okay, now when the mushrooms that you've collected or purchased ages, it gets dehydrated and becomes tough, like these button mushrooms here. And that's because the ratio of chitin to water has changed. So before it was like a lot of water, a little chitin. Once they start dehydrating, it's a lot less. There's a lot less water, and so they'll taste. They'll be tougher. They'll be tougher unless they're somehow rehydrated. Anyway, to avoid this problem, just select plump mushrooms, much as you would fruit. And place them in a paper bag or rolled in a slightly damp bag or paper towels in the fridge, because the fridge is actually pretty dry. And use fresh mushrooms fresh, and in a minute we'll be talking about how to use dried mushrooms. Don't wash mushrooms until you plan to use them, unless you also plan to dry them with fans. All mushrooms can be washed. I mean, I know there's such a silly controversy about this, but they all can be washed to varying degrees of violence. I mean, here's an example. These are chanterelles. Look at how we're beating them up. They love it. They get nice and clean. Okay, turn that off. Some fragile mushrooms like black trumpets, they may tear from manhandling, and morels can crumble, but most are really tough enough. Mushrooms don't usually absorb water. I mean, after all, we tend to collect them in the rain. They actually produce a kind of waterproof material that protects the cap from rain damage. Just don't wash your mushrooms and put them in the fridge in a plastic bag. I mean, think of them as you would raspberries. If you wash raspberries, put them in a plastic bag in the fridge, the next day they're going to have mold on them. Same thing could happen to the mushrooms. One of the ways you can tell that mushrooms are turning is that if they get kind of slimy, and that's the result of bacteria beginning the process of breaking down the mushrooms. Now it's going to fight me. There we go. Okay, so hopefully you found loads of mushrooms this fall. How do we preserve them? Well, it really depends on the species. All mushrooms can be frozen. You can blanch it, you need to blanch the mushrooms first to stop the enzymatic action, and then pack them in freezer baggies with some water. You can also saute until the mushrooms give up their water and then freeze them with that water they gave up. I recommend sauteing in butter, which just generally likes to be frozen better than oil. Not all mushrooms dry equally, however. Good dryers are morels and porcini, shiitake, wood ear. Drying can concentrate their flavor. The reason why you don't wash mushrooms, as it says here, the reason why you don't wash mushrooms before drying is because wet mushrooms take longer to dehydrate. And if it takes too long to dehydrate, molds can get a foothold and have the opportunity to grow. Mushrooms really need to be cracker crisp. That's 90% of all the moisture out. So the times may vary, but it's usually 8 to 12 hours at 125 degrees Fahrenheit. The lower trays will dry faster, so you may want to switch them up. Just do not increase the heat to speed up drying time, or you're going to end up cooking the mushrooms and they'll get this kind of burnt or caramelly flavor. Conditioning is distributing the remaining 10% of the moisture evenly, and you do that by placing the dried mushrooms in a large jar, and you just shake it gently every day for about a week. And this distributes the moisture, that 10% that remains throughout the food. So to store, you place dried mushrooms in an airtight container in a cool, dark place, like your pantry, the way you do your other home preserves. And dried mushrooms last about a year. If you're, I have a note here about how to dry and store psilocybin mushrooms. I'm going to skip that. Ovens and sun dryers are kind of less predictable, certainly on the East Coast. And so if you can, get a dryer, it's really worth the investment. And then when it comes time to rehydrate, you soak them and rinse until all the debris is gone. Now, if your mushrooms are very clean, like these porcini, you can rehydrate them in whatever liquid you'll be using in the cooking, like cream. One of the recipes in the Fantastic Fungi Cookbook by Charles Luce is he puts into a ball jar dried porcinis, covers it with cream, there's a little salt in there, and then he puts it in a low oven for like 2 hours. And what comes out is this unctuous, thick, creamy stuff that he spreads on chicken tenderloins and turkey, on filleted, butterflied poultry, and then he rolls it up and roasts it, and it's delicious. Dried mushrooms are great in a lot of ways. You can, besides adding them to foods, you can also grind them up into powders for an array of uses, such as rubs to make butters, and these are little Christmas salts for someone, and to add to dishes for like a bump in flavor. So when it comes to canning, you can't water bath canned mushrooms without adding acid, because mushrooms are alkaline. They're a low acid food. You can make refrigerator pickles with mushrooms, but there's no USDA data for canning wild mushrooms with or without added acid. In fact, the USDA says don't deal with wild mushrooms at all. The only USDA data, and that's data that I tend to use, that's available is for white buttons, whole or sliced. So for canning any species but white button mushrooms, you have to try it and reproduce the volume and density of white buttons. I mean, it's a guessing game, and it's not 100% accurate. So pictured here are these small morels that I boiled for 10 minutes and then canned in fresh water. And I estimated they were about the same size as the white button mushrooms pieces that are in the USDA recipe. This is really all we've got to work with. To be on the safe side, I would never eat a home canned mushroom out of a jar. I always sterilize, and you do that by boiling the food product for 10 minutes at sea level, and that will kill any spoilers present, including the bacteria that causes botulism. And remember, just because of the chitin in on the mushroom cell walls, the mushroom's integrity really will hold up. Come on. All right. So in 2021, we published this book. That's a shiitake duck congee on the cover. The book has 100 recipes from 50 authors, and I tested twice that many. And in the process, I learned a lot about cooking mushrooms from the people who I think understand them the best, and that's mushroom hunters and mycophiles. So I want to share a few takeaways from cooking all these different mushroom recipes by so many different authors. Number one, I learned mushrooms cook up differently than vegetables, more like meat. Two, I learned how many different mushroom flavors there are and how those tastes can be enhanced by combining them with complementary ingredients like chanterelles and apricots, hericium and fish. Hericium is lion's mane. And three, I learned mushrooms are an excellent substitution for meat in recipes and how cooking meat can inform cooking mushrooms. And finally, I learned to love the cultivated varieties on a whole new level. So let's look at these 4 points. To prep mushrooms, you can chop, you can tear, you can leave tiny mushrooms whole. It's, the sky's the limit. Most recipes that I've seen call for sauteing mushrooms in fat, but you really don't have to do this. Mushrooms handle moist heat better than plants, so you can boil them, steam them, or dry cook them first and then finish in fat, and you'll have a less greasy result. So on the left, to pan braise, first brown in a dry pan, then add liquid. And when you cook in a dry pan, keep in mind not to crowd the mushrooms. You see how like sparse these are? These are little bits and pieces of puffballs. They give mushrooms give off a lot of water, and if they're crowded in the pan, they'll end up boiling rather than browning. If you wanted to do a wet saute, you would combine the mushrooms with a small amount of water and you cook rapidly. It's maybe a good idea to salt after cooking mushrooms. There's this old wives' tale that says mushrooms will be more tender if salted after, and that may be because salting urges the quick release of moisture from the mushrooms, which would end up making them a little tougher. But it is important that they be cooked through. And as I've said, what constitutes that is a bit of a mystery, but a general rule of thumb is cook the mushrooms around 10 minutes until it releases its water and the water evaporates, or in water, like a low boil or medium heat for 10 minutes. Besides cooking through, this sterilizes the mushroom should there be any worms or bacteria present, and there probably are. And don't worry about al dente. I've never heard of an al dente mushroom. They're already al dente because of the chitin. Maillard. So lots of recipes say to caramelize mushrooms, but mushrooms don't actually caramelize. And this is a little bit of a semantic thing, but caramelization is when carbs and sugars in plants turn brown and add flavor. Mushrooms and meats don't caramelize. They experience this Maillard reaction. And that's when amino acids and sugar turn brown, are heated and turn brown, and then and that's what adds flavor. The cooked amino acids and sugar adds that flavor. And one of those amino acids is glutamate, which is responsible for the umami flavor in mushrooms, that meaty savoriness. Mushrooms, like meat and vegetables, depending on the vegetable, can be roasted, grilled, sauteed, boiled, braised. Really, the sky's the limit. And remember, you can always boil mushrooms to hold in your fridge and then make all kinds of other stuff like these. This is a little bowl of boiled chanterelles that has a little olive oil in it and some a little stuff, and it was a nice room temp salad. And then the next day I had some grilled scallops, threw them in. And then the day after I had some boiled potatoes, threw those in. So it's like the gift that keeps giving. Anyway, the boiled mushrooms will hold for quite a few days in your fridge. So as wild mushroom eaters, many of us have the practice of cooking up a small amount plain to get a sense of their flavor and how they interact with our GI system. Gary Linkoff once pointed, he was a great a mentor of mine and a great mushroom educator. He once pointed out that wild mushrooms have all kinds of interesting proteins in them. So, we don't all react the same way. Most people cook different mushrooms the same way nonetheless. We cook white button mushrooms the same way as maitake mushrooms. And that's kind of a shame, because just as you wouldn't cook corn the same way as you cook kale, so too mushrooms need to be appreciated for their uniqueness if you're going to get the most out of them. And one way to do that is to sniff. If they smell fruity like an apricot, think of what apricots cook well with. So for example, we have here chanterelles have an apricot-y flavor. So this dish is roasted pork with chanterelles and apricot jam. Black trumpets have a deep, musty flavor, not unlike blue cheese. So this dish is farfalle with a gorgonzola and black trumpet sauce. Hericium, aka lion's mane, have a hint of a fishy flavor. So they marry well with fish, like this spaghetti alla vongole. These are all fantastic fungi recipes. In fact, everything going forward, or from pretty much everything from the book. Okay, so when it comes to cooking, there are definitely classic pairings that most mushrooms seem to like. For example, cream, eggs, cheese, and tofu. So from the upper right, onion dip with porcini powder, delicious. Stuffed eggs with black trumpets. Here we have baked eggs with boletes and peas. So stupid easy, but really elegant. And this is a chanterelle cream sauce with cooked with a little filet mignon, which I have to say is like a perfect recipe. That came from Jim Osland, who did a wonderful book on Parisian cooking. On the more savory side, onion, garlic, shallot, leeks, thyme, rosemary, paprika, hot peppers, vinegar. Think meat spices. And carbs. Mushrooms love carbs like rice, corn, and wheat products. Here we have risotto with morels and ham, polenta with mushroom sauce on the board, and pappardelle with boletes and squash. It's easy to substitute the meat in recipes with mushrooms. They really cook up similarly. You just look for similar morphology. So like a shredded chicken dish could be substituted, the chicken could be substituted with shredded oyster mushrooms. But beef chunks might be best with substituted with hunks of cremini, as here. The good side of all the water in mushrooms, like as I said, up to 90%, is that they make mushrooms a low-fat food. And what this paper here is talking about is you won't lack energy from eating mushrooms in place of meat, despite the fact they are a low-calorie food, as I said, equal pretty much to lettuce. The idea of the mushroom diet is by replacing mushrooms for meat in your recipes, you lose weight because you're taking in less calories, because mushrooms are mostly water, but you don't snack because those mushrooms that have been studied contain all 9 essential amino acids that make up a complete protein, so you end up feeling full. Okay, so here are other meat or fish replacement ideas. The first is a dish from Sri Lanka, hot buttered squid, only with oyster mushrooms instead. Next, we have fried chicken sandwiches with chicken mushrooms, chicken of the woods mushrooms. They're like battered in buttermilk and all that. They're just fabulous. And here, instead of beef and beans, beans and boletes. Just as satisfying, really. And of course, you can augment almost any protein with mushrooms, which is really a food cost saver. So here we have a pot roast with dried porcini, and on the side, here's maitake with spetzel. Steamed mussels with mushrooms and potatoes and chorizo. And here, chicken with sherry, butter and cream, and morels. This is incredibly easy to make. All of them are easy to make, but the chicken especially so, because you just brown the chicken, put in a stick of butter, half a bottle of dry sherry, and as many morels as you can as you can gather, and and you just braise that chicken. You just cook that chicken until it's tender, and then finish with a little cream, and in this case, some tarragon too. Yum. Okay, so finally, I want to talk a little bit about cultivated mushrooms. It's a pretty common gotcha for like mushroom hunters when they see wild mushroom risotto on a menu and ask, what mushrooms there are, what mushrooms are in the wild mushroom risotto. Because if the waiter says, well, it has maitake in it and a Grifola frondosa and it's May, that it's not wild because the Grifola frondosa comes up in the late summer. You can be pretty confident that if you're seeing maitake in a risotto in May, that it's a cultivated varietal. More and more species are being cultivated. I guess as interest in cooking with mushroom grows, and I'm thrilled about that. The mushrooms that are cultivated tend to be all saprobes, meaning they're mushrooms that are the fruit bodies of fungi that eat dead or dying stuff like fallen wood. The mushrooms that stay exclusively wild, those are the mycorrhizal mushrooms. They're mutualists like chanterelles and porcini. Their relationship is the fungus lives in a symbiotic relationship with a living tree, and that's a much harder cultivation proposition. I mean, the only mycorrhizal fungus that is grown, to my knowledge, are truffles. You have to plant a whole orchard, and it's very costly to produce those truffles, but you get a lot of money for them if they come up and you can sell them. When I was first into wild mushrooms, I kind of looked down on Agaricus bisporus, the white button mushrooms, but they're really fabulous if you can get them fresh. That's what it's all about. If you can get them fresh, and it helps to know how to cook them. And the duxelle is a great way to enjoy the Agaricus bisporus, the champignon, the white button mushroom. The original duxelles is with white buttons, but you can make it with any mushroom you like. In this situation, I have a little video. The champignon is chopped fine. I'm chopping it and cooked down to a crumbly paste. And you can make duxelles, as I said, with all these different mushrooms, and they'll still work. Except maybe very, very fine mushrooms like black trumpets. Anyway, duxelles are indicated in French recipes, but there's lots of uses in American cookery too, like in modern American cookery, I guess. In this case, what we have here is these are like English style sausage rolls. They're so yummy. What you do is you get like Pepperidge Farm puff pastry. You cut it in strips, you put down some mustard, then you put a sausage meat and the duxelle, and you roll it up and bake it. It's like the ultimate, football game kind of snack. And over here are seasoned pork and duxelles in a dumpling wrapper, and then we brown it and then add a little water just to finish it in steam. So duxelles are really versatile. You can use them on top of pizza. You can stuff a chicken thigh with them. If you're feeling fancy, you can make a beef Wellington. I mean, they are an instant pasta sauce. Duxelles holds in the fridge for about a week. So if you get a bunch of white buttons in and make up a batch of duxelle, and you'll be able to use it in numerous recipes throughout the week. Oh, sorry. All these pictures are Agaricus bisporus mushroom dishes. Did you know that white buttons, creminis, and portobellos are all the same species? So what we have here is a white button, fennel, and blood orange salad, Agaricus bisporus salad. What we have here is a grilled portobello with Havarti cheese. I highly recommend the Havarti cheese. We tried it with all these different kinds of cheeses, but the Havarti is just like really packs a punch. Very beefy at the end of the day. Portobello, also Agaricus bisporus. And here we have a cremini aillo, which is a Spanish recipe with garlic. It's very strong and intense and sexy. Cremini, also Agaricus bisporus. So what is the difference between wild and cultivated mushrooms? Number one, freshness. Number two, there may be flavor differences. Tom Volk once explained to me that if a mushroom is not under environmental pressures, and a cultivated mushroom is not the way a wild mushroom is, that fungus may not expend the energy to produce secondary metabolites, like chemicals that deal with environmental stresses, like let's say an insect attack. Those chemicals or secondary metabolites may add flavor to the mushroom. The cultivated mushrooms do not have those same environmental pressures, and so the fungus may not produce those energy expensive chemicals. So when exploring recipes for cooking mushrooms, we don't have a whole lot in the English or early American vernacular, but you can definitely look to other cultures. Asian dishes like these, for example. This is a chicken with wood-ear mushrooms. Here we have mushroom tempura. Here we have a shiitake and cauliflower with a numbing chili sauce, which was surprising. It's so light, but it's really packs a punch. Here, matsutake doben mushi, which is a steamed mushroom fish soup, and matsutake gohan rice, which is a sort of steamed rice dish. And as time goes on, you might find yourself thinking outside the box. I know that many of our authors totally did. These are a chanterelle ice cream, and that's got a little candy cap butter sugar cookie, stuck in it. And candy caps are kind of amazing mushroom that has a distinct maple syrup flavor. This is a crab and cordyceps soup. And this is a candied wood ear. I mean, you can actually candy a lot of different types of mushrooms. And, as time, sorry, let me go back. Oops. Okay. Also, you can make infusions and flavored drinks like these. This is a candy cap hot milk punch with bourbon. And because of that candy cap flavor, there's this additional layer of like maple syrup on that drink. It's really delicious. Candy caps are amazing because when you consume them, your body smells of the candy cap of maple syrup. Your sweat smells like maple syrup. For a while, it's a real weird phenomenon. I guess it's kind of online of when you eat asparagus and your pee has that funny smell. So candy caps do it as well, except it's really a sweet, wonderful maple syrup smell. This is a golden vodka. And that's where chanterelles have been steeped in vodka for quite a while. It turned out to be like not good at room temperature. And I was thinking, maybe this recipe won't work. But then we chilled it and it was fabulous. So that's an easy and fun thing to try to make, as are chanterelle shrubs, and mushroom shrubs of all sorts, which is a mild vinegar mixer. It's kind of perfect for sober folks, or to make an exotic cocktail. You may want to be careful about like dropping raw mushrooms like black trumpets into your white wine, which is actually a thing, because it might be a way to get food poisoning. But if you use strong spirits like vodka, or you cook the mushrooms first, then you're probably good to go. You can also, by the way, make infusions like extracts, like candy cap extract to add to cookies and things. So in time, and as your knowledge of cooking mushrooms grows, so will your knowledge of mycology, because for the mycophagist, cooking is the window by which we understand mushrooms in a deeper way. So a few cooking takeaways. I'm not going to read off my slide. I said I'm going to tell you this story. Years ago, I was showing off in front of Jacques Pepin, who is a friend of my dad's. And I was, just into wild mushrooms, and I was learning their Latin binomials. And, I was like, well, I was being kind of a snob about cultivated mushrooms. And Jacques is a very subtle man, but he makes this point. He said to me, Eugenia, it's not the mushroom, it's the cook. Okay, so that wraps up my presentation. Please feel free to send me questions or communicate on Instagram. I try to stay on top of all my cooking adventures there. So now I think I will end my show. Let's see, where are you here? And I have to do one other thing, stop share. Hi.
Hi, Eugenia. Wow, that was fantastic. I'm really looking forward to listening to the recording. So if any of you are watching this and are having the same feeling, we will be putting this on our YouTube channel. There's so much I learned, and I won't go over every single point or I'll use up all the chat time, but a couple of things I wanted to mention about mushrooms upsetting a person's stomach if they're not the type of mushroom or how they're prepared. I have a friend who believes that she's allergic to mushrooms because she got an upset stomach when she ate them. And now I'm understanding that probably something else was going on. So I really appreciated that point. I thought it was absolutely fascinating that the same mushroom is going to have different taste, properties, and even safety depending on what tree they're growing on. So that was something that was completely beyond what I was thinking. And then just really yesterday, somebody was telling me that they went to eat in this pretty nice restaurant, and they had this cream mushroom pasta dish that just didn't work. Everybody that was eating it at the table was like, something's not right here. And I found it really perplexing when this friend told me that. And after hearing your presentation, it's like, oh, perhaps the chef didn't really understand or appreciate the difference in mushrooms, and that you're going to get something that's very different if you're doing a mushroom and a cream sauce with one type of mushroom versus another. So prior to that, I just kind of thought he was a picky eater. I just have one question for you, and that is right now, maybe offline, I'll take more, but when you go to a restaurant and they say something like, tonight's special is this mushroom over pasta and a cream sauce, do you typically ask like what kind of mushroom it is?
Oh, totally. Oh, totally. I also look at the price. So if it's like not really quite expensive, and then if it's expensive and they say it's Morels, that makes sense. But yeah, it's useful to know about them, just like it's useful to know, about any kind of food that you order at a restaurant. It's often what happens with people and mushroom clubs and people who are interested in mushrooms is they'll know more than folks in the restaurant.
Sure.
It's a field or a hobby or whatever, an interest that is growing and developing. So I'm expecting new waves of chefs coming out that are much more attuned to mushroom cookery, to mycophagy, than their predecessors. I think that it's just going to get better.
Well, and I'm also very much looking forward to cooking things out of your cookbook. So
Yeah.
I read it So I'm really looking forward
Yeah,
to
the
them.
recipes are delicious. I mean, there's like 50 different, authors, and some of them were so great. Like there's this one woman, and if they were encouraged, like they send in a recipe, and I would say, "Wow, this is really good," and then they go, "You want more?" And then before I knew it, all these recipes would be coming in. There's this one woman who was just substituting mushrooms for meat in all these different recipes from all over the world. It was like a UN of recipes that were coming my way. And they were terrific. She ended up being one of the stars of the book as a result.
Well, I guess I should let our audience ask their questions. So we had one that was actually emailed in from Cynthia. She said, I've heard that mushrooms can be cooked in oil to bring out their medicinal properties. Is that true?
So the whole medicinal conversation is one, complex. Two, I'm not a nutritionist, so I'm not deeply involved in that. But the people who use mushroom extracts medicinally, that's one way of taking them in. I am of the mentality that eating mushrooms, and that's the way kind of we're built to get those nutrients. So I think incorporating mushrooms into your diet has a lot of medicinal benefits. They're a functional benefits, not only for your own body, but environmentally too, because the Agaricus bisporus turns poop into protein in a week, and it grows in manure and stuff like that. So these mushrooms are really good, can be very sustainable environmentally. But the specifics of how to enhance the medicinal aspect of a mushroom depend on the mushroom, depend on what protein or enzymes you're hoping to lift. I couldn't tell you. There is no generalization that I'm aware
of. Well, thank you. Also on the medicinal topic, Gloria asked, I've heard that vitamin D content in mushrooms, I'm assuming, depends on exposure to UV light. Any suggestions on how to do this?
Yeah, put them in the sun. It actually works. The vitamin D can be amplified because the mushrooms have something that's sort of similar to melanin. And when exposed to UV light, the melanin converts into vitamin D2. And so there's product for a while. I wonder if they're still around. I haven't seen them in a long time, but there was products that you could buy that were irradiated mushrooms, so that they were amped up vitamin D mushrooms. And it's really like putting the mushrooms on a tanning bed. It's not like, nuking them or anything, but I haven't seen them in the market. They were kind of around for a while. I haven't seen them for a while, but yeah, you can just put them in the sunshine and they will do that. They'll do that even after they've been, picked. Just put them on a tray.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Cheryl asked, I found that no matter how totally dry mushrooms seem to be from my dehydrator, they need to be stored in glass jars at refrigerator temperature. Even if seemingly totally crisp and dry at room temperature, they will start growing mold in about a week.
Well, so I don't know the circumstances of what the of what she's dealing with, but beyond this, what she said, but I think that if it's truly 90% dry, and she conditions, right? She gets that 10% of remaining moisture distributed throughout the jar. They should hold without issues. There may be a situation of there must be another element involved that's causing the mold, but there wouldn't be mold if there wasn't moisture. And maybe the draw, are you using slightly damp jars? I mean, I really don't know, but you can try these little silica packets, give that a try and see if your dried mushrooms, because that can pull out some of the moisture and see if that doesn't help. But yeah, that's weird. Try conditioning and try the silica packet, see if it helps.
So on the other side of dry, Jeffrey asked, will you describe in more detail what is happening when a mushroom releases its water during the early stage of cooking?
Yeah, I used to know this, but I've kind of forgotten. So with heat urges the water out of the mushroom. The water, because the mushroom's got a lot of water in its cells, and heat urges the water out of the mushroom. It's the cell walls, I guess, break enough for that water to be released into the pan. And in some cases, it'll be a lot of water. In other cases, it'll be less. The older and drier the mushroom, the less water they're going to produce because they've been dehydrating in your fridge or wherever for a while. So then once the water is out, you can either, use that water because it actually has flavor, or you can continue cooking until that water evaporates for kind of a full, what's generally considered a full cook on those mushrooms. Is that the kind of thing you're asking? Not positive. I answered what you were exactly looking for.
Jeffrey, if you're there, if you're still here. Oh, and we do have somebody else that saved some silica packages.
They should touch.
As far as my understanding of the question, you answered it, but Jeffrey,
Jeffrey says he's good, so that's great.
Okay, great.
Okay.
So Lenise asked, where can I find lion's mane mushrooms? And I know people are watching this program from around the country, but if you happen to be in Cincinnati, I know one place is you can find them at the farmer's shed at Findlay Market. And other folks, if they know, contribute to the chat. But Eugenia, how would you answer that question?
Well, you can find them two ways. You can find them in the wild. They're coming up around this time of year on the East Coast. We find them on hardwoods. They're growing up high on trees, so sometimes they can be sort of hard to spot. But it looks like a snowball stuck to a tree. Otherwise, they're cultivated, and they're still kind of a specialty cultivar. So I don't see it in my local supermarket, but I see it in my local Asian markets here in New York City, and definitely in the farmers markets. So hopefully between the three. Rich Life Farm and Fungi in New Richmond. Okay. I'm sure, a little bit of research would turn up some cultivators for you in your area.
And in the chat, folks can see other places of business that are recommended that can do that as well. Let's see. And are there certain mushrooms that only grow in certain places? My family in Italy forages. Oh, the questions are coming in wild and crazy then. My family in Italy forages mushrooms, and I'm wondering if I can find the same ones here.
Not necessarily. And to make it more complicated, they may be genetically, you can have mushrooms, like, for example, Boletus edulis, which is a fantastic mushroom that the Italians pick, in the Apennines and stuff. That we have like Boletus edulis here in the United States too. They're called Boletus edulis because they have enough genes in common, but they don't have all their genes in common. So the spectrum of variation within a species, it's a kind of an art form that the taxonomists sort of say, okay, now we're going to push that mushroom into another species because it's too genetically different. But those kinds of estimations are, not made by someone like me. They're made by mycologists, and especially in taxonomy. So the chances are, I don't know, it depends on the mushroom, and if it's here, it might not be exactly the same, but maybe it's better. Maybe it will taste better. You never know. But lots of Italian mushrooms are sorry, lots of Italian mushrooms are found in the United States. If you're hunting regionally, like if you're into hunting, I highly recommend not only joining your mushroom club, but seeing if you can find like a regional identification guide, because there's so much specificity to particular areas that mushrooms just don't even look the same. Like the chanterelles in California, like they're another species. They're huge, like big, giant, floppy things. They call them mud bugs in California, whereas the ones in the east are like these, stubby, stubby super aromatic little mushrooms. So there's a lot of variation, and but if you're on the search for a particular mushroom, go for it. See where it grows, because it very well could have an American cousin.
So we have one more question that I'm going to ask, and this is from Nicholas. You mentioned ovale as a mushroom that is delicious eaten raw. Do you know why so few mushrooms work without cooking?
Well, there's, I don't know why. Don't know why the mushrooms that are considered a-okay and don't cause GI upset. It might be because of, obviously it's because of some, protein or some enzymes that are in in most mushrooms that make them unpalatable raw, or that can cause GI upset. Some folks say that it's actually chitin that causes GI upset, but I don't buy that. That's just me, but I don't think it's the chitin, because if that was the case, then we couldn't eat anything raw. And there's no problem. Most people don't have a problem eating like white buttons raw and porcini. And so I imagine that but what is, I imagine that in the case of those mushrooms, which the Boletus edulis, the Amanita caesarea, and Agaricus bisporus, that they lack a problematic enzyme that are in other mushrooms. But that's, really not, I'm sure that's not that satisfying an answer. It isn't for me either. So I'm going to go do a little research and double check. But yeah, it's tricky. And also it's very dependent on personal, your own like GI system. I mean, there's people who don't like raw mushrooms at all, no matter what. They just have a hard time digesting them. And so.
Well, I want to wrap up the chat with one final comment, and this is from Steve, and he said, "Fantastic program, thank you. I watched it while cooking in my kitchen." And I very much like this comment, because that Steve is my husband, and I know we have ice cream. I know we have mushrooms in the fridge, so I'm looking very forward to what I might be walking home to tonight. So thank you for being an inspiration as well.
Thank you.
Eugenia, thank you so much. This was so much fun. The hour just whizzed by. I'd like to talk to you more in the future anyway, just offline. I'm sure everybody feels that way that's in tonight's program. I also want to thank our audience for joining us, and remind you that programs like this are supported in part by members of the Lloyd Library. If you'd like to contribute to these programs, visit our website at lloydlibrary.org. And we hope to see you next time. Thanks, and have a great night.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.